The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his iconic red tunic for what he hoped would be an ordinary Tuesday. At 28 years old, Mitchell had served as one of the Queen's Guard for 6 years, and he thought he had seen every possible way tourists could test his legendary composure. He was wrong. The day started like any other, with the changing of the guard ceremony drawing its usual crowd of camera-wielding visitors from around the world. Mitchell stood perfectly still at his post, his expression stoic beneath the towering, black bearskin hat that had become synonymous with British royal tradition. The rifle at his shoulder remained motionless, and his eyes stared straight ahead, trained to ignore the constant flash of cameras and the excited chatter of onlookers. What Mitchell didn't know was that a group of American college students on spring break had made a bet the night before at their London hostel. The challenge was simple but foolish. Whoever could get the biggest reaction from one of the famously unflappable guards would win free drinks for the entire group. 20-year-old Brad Thompson, a business major from Texas with more confidence than common sense, had accepted the challenge with the swagger of someone who had never encountered a truly disciplined soldier. Thompson approached Mitchell's post, around 10 in the morning, his phone already recording as his friends gathered nearby. The first attempt was predictable. Thompson began making faces and gestures directly in front of the guard, trying to get him to crack a smile or break character. Mitchell remained as immovable as the palace walls behind him, his training kicking in automatically. Years of preparation had conditioned him to treat such behavior as mere background noise. Growing frustrated with the lack of response, Thompson decided to escalate. He began telling jokes, some inappropriate, others simply loud and obnoxious. Other tourists started to take notice, some finding the spectacle entertaining while others looked uncomfortable with the obvious disrespect being shown. Mitchell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his stance remained perfect, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The situation took a turn when Thompson, emboldened by what he mistook for weakness, decided to get physical. He reached out to touch Mitchell's rifle, claiming he just wanted to check if it was real. This was the moment everything changed. In one fluid motion that spoke to years of military training, Mitchell's voice boomed across the courtyard with an authority that made nearby pigeons take flight. "Step back from the Queen's Guard." The command was delivered with such force and precision that Thompson jumped backward, nearly colliding with a group of Japanese tourists who had been quietly observing the spectacle. The sudden transformation from statue-like stillness to commanding presence caught everyone off guard. This wasn't the gentle, polite correction of a museum guide. This was the voice of someone trained for combat, someone who took their duty seriously. But Thompson, rather than learning from this clear warning, interpreted it differently. To him, this was progress. He had gotten a reaction. His friends were laughing and recording, and the attention from other tourists seemed to fuel his desire to push further. What he failed to understand was that Mitchell hadn't broken character. He had simply shifted into a different aspect of his role, the protector. The crowd around them had grown considerably. Word was spreading through the tourist groups that something interesting was happening at the guard post. Some visitors pulled out their phones to record, while others whispered among themselves about the American student who seemed determined to test the patience of the traditionally stoic guard. A few concerned onlookers could sense that the situation was heading in a problematic direction. Mitchell, despite his outward composure, was running through his training protocols. The Queen's Guard weren't just ceremonial figures dressed up for tourist photos. They were active soldiers with real responsibilities and the authority to enforce them. Every guard carried loaded weapons and had the training to use them if necessary. More importantly, they had clear guidelines about when and how to respond to various levels of disruption or threat. Thompson's next move would prove to be his biggest mistake. Interpreting the guard's warning as part of some elaborate performance, he decided to test the boundaries further. He began to circle Mitchell, making commentary about the uniform, the hat, and what he perceived as the absurdity of the whole tradition. His voice grew louder, his gestures more dramatic, and his disrespect more obvious to everyone watching. What Thompson didn't realize was that his behavior wasn't just annoying, It was beginning to cross into territory that the guards were specifically trained to address. The Queen's Guard have protocols for dealing with disruptions that range from verbal warnings to physical intervention. Each escalation is measured and purposeful, designed to maintain both security and dignity. As the morning progressed and more tourists gathered to watch the unfolding drama, Mitchell remained focused on his duty while mentally preparing for what might need to happen next. His training had taught him patience, but it had also taught him when patience was no longer the appropriate response. The line between harmless tourist enthusiasm and genuine disruption was becoming increasingly clear, and Thompson was dancing closer to crossing it with each passing minute. The other members of Thompson's group began to sense that their friend might be taking things too far. But the momentum of the situation and the encouragement of the growing crowd kept pushing the confrontation forward. None of them understood the seriousness of what they were witnessing or the level of training and authority possessed by the man in the red coat standing before them. The stage was set for what would become a lesson in respect, tradition, and the consequences of mistaking professionalism for weakness. Mitchell stood ready, his years of training condensed into this single moment where duty would meet foolishness head-on. The confrontation escalated when Thompson made his second critical error. Emboldened by what he thought was a successful first interaction, he decided to try something that would definitely get attention. He pulled out his phone and began taking selfies while leaning against the guard post, treating Mitchell like a tourist attraction rather than an active duty soldier. "Hey everyone, look at this," Thompson called out to his friends, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "I'm getting the full British experience." He posed for photos, making peace signs and goofy faces while practically touching Mitchell's uniform. The disrespect was becoming more blatant with each passing moment, and other tourists in the crowd began to shift uncomfortably. Mitchell's training kicked in at a deeper level. The Queen's Guard weren't just ceremonial. They were real soldiers from elite regiments including the Grenadier Guards, Coldstream Guards, Scots Guards, Irish Guards, and Welsh Guards. Each man standing post had completed rigorous military training and was selected for both physical prowess and mental discipline. They weren't actors in costumes. They were warriors in dress uniform. The situation reached a new level when Thompson decided to test what he assumed were the rules of the guards' behavior. He began asking questions in a loud, mocking tone, apparently believing that the guards weren't allowed to speak or respond. "Can you hear me in there?" he shouted, waving his hand in front of Mitchell's face. "Hello? Anybody home?" What Thompson didn't understand was that the Queen's Guard operate under specific protocols. They maintain their ceremonial stance when possible, but they're also authorized to respond to disruptions with increasing levels of intervention. The famous stoicism isn't about being unable to act. It's about choosing when action is necessary. Other tourists began to take notice of the growing spectacle. A British family with young children moved away from the area, the father shaking his head in disapproval. An elderly woman from Germany approached one of Thompson's friends and quietly suggested they should encourage their companion to stop, but her advice was brushed off with laughter. The crowd dynamic was becoming part of the problem. Some tourists found the confrontation entertaining and began recording with their phones, inadvertently encouraging Thompson to continue his disruptive behavior. Others looked uncomfortable, but didn't know how to intervene. The situation was creating exactly the kind of disturbance that the guards were trained to prevent. Mitchell maintained his position, but those who knew what to look for could see the subtle signs of preparation. His grip on his rifle had shifted, slightly. His weight distribution had changed, and although his expression remained neutral, there was an intensity in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He was moving through mental checklists, evaluating the threat level and considering his options. Thompson's next move sealed his fate. Apparently frustrated that his previous attempts hadn't generated the reaction he wanted, he decided to try physical contact. He reached out and actually touched Mitchell's uniform, tugging slightly on the red tunic while laughing and calling for his friends to record the moment. The response was immediate and shocking in its intensity. Mitchell's voice exploded across the courtyard with a volume and authority that made everyone within 50 feet freeze in place. "Make way for the Queen's Guard." The command was delivered with military precision, each word hitting like a hammer blow. But this wasn't just a verbal warning. In one fluid motion, Mitchell stepped forward and shouldered his rifle in a movement that was both technically perfect and utterly intimidating. The transformation from motionless statue to active soldier happened so quickly that Thompson stumbled backward in shock, his phone nearly slipping from his suddenly shaky hands. The crowd's reaction was immediate and varied. Those familiar with military protocol recognized that Thompson had crossed a serious line. Parents grabbed their children and moved back, while other tourists continued to record, sensing that they were witnessing something significant. The atmosphere had shifted from light-hearted tourist entertainment to something far more serious. Thompson, however, still didn't fully grasp what was happening. Instead of backing down and apologizing, he tried to laugh it off, telling his friends that he had really gotten to the guy this time. His misinterpretation of the situation was about to cost him dearly, because Mitchell wasn't finished. The guard began to march forward with the precise, measured steps that are drilled into every member of the Queen's Guard during their training. Each footfall echoed off the palace walls with mechanical precision, and the sound seemed to grow louder as he advanced. This wasn't random movement. It was a controlled demonstration of authority designed to clear space and establish dominance. Thompson found himself backing up rapidly, his earlier confidence evaporating as he realized that the guard was actually moving toward him with obvious intent. The rifle, which had seemed like a ceremonial prop just moments before, suddenly looked very real and very functional. The other tourists in the immediate area began to scatter, creating a clear corridor between Mitchell and his target. "Whoa, okay," Thompson said, his voice now carrying a note of genuine concern. He continued backing up, but Mitchell kept advancing with that same measured pace. The guard's expression remained neutral, but there was something in his eyes that suggested Thompson's time for games had run out. The situation had completely transformed. What had started as what Thompson thought was harmless tourist fun had become a serious confrontation with a trained soldier who had the authority and ability to enforce respect for his position. The crowd watched in fascination and growing concern as the two figures played out a drama that would serve as a lesson for everyone present about the difference between ceremony and weakness. Mitchell's advance continued, methodical and intimidating, while Thompson found himself running out of space and options. The lesson was just beginning, and it was becoming clear that the guard intended to deliver it thoroughly and memorably. The confrontation reached its peak when Thompson, still backing away from Mitchell's methodical advance, made the mistake of trying to turn the situation into a joke for social media. Instead of showing the respect and deference that the situation clearly demanded, he held up his phone and began recording himself while continuing to retreat. "This is crazy, guys," he said into his phone camera, his voice now carrying a nervous edge despite his attempts to maintain his earlier bravado. "This guard is actually chasing me. This is going straight to TikTok." His friends continued recording from various angles, creating multiple documentation of what was becoming an increasingly serious incident. Mitchell's response was swift and decisive. In a voice that seemed to originate from somewhere deep in his chest, he delivered another command that echoed off the palace walls like a cannon shot. "Get back, make way." The sheer volume and authority in his voice caused several tourists to actually jump in surprise, and the crowd instinctively moved further away from the confrontation. But Mitchell wasn't finished. Having established that Thompson was unwilling to respect verbal commands, the guard shifted to the next level of his training. He executed a perfect about-face turn and began marching directly toward Thompson with increased pace, his rifle held at the port arms position. The movement was fluid, professional, and absolutely terrifying to someone who suddenly realized they might have pushed too far. Thompson's retreat became more urgent, but he was running out of space. The palace courtyard, while large, had boundaries, and other tourists and barriers were limiting his escape routes. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that this wasn't a performance or a game. This was a real soldier responding to what he perceived as a real threat to the dignity and security of his post. The crowd dynamic had completely shifted. What had started as entertainment for some onlookers had become uncomfortable to watch. Parents were pulling their children away from the area, while other adults looked on with a mixture of fascination and concern. Some tourists continued recording, but the mood had changed from amusement to apprehension. A security guard from the palace approached the situation, speaking quietly into his radio while keeping his eyes on the developing confrontation. He didn't intervene immediately, recognizing that the Queen's Guard had the authority to handle the situation, but his presence signaled that additional resources were being positioned if needed. Thompson finally seemed to realize that he was in serious trouble. His attempts at humor became more desperate, and for the first time since the incident began, genuine fear crept into his voice. Okay, I get it," he said, still holding his phone but no longer trying to make jokes. I'm backing off. But Mitchell had passed the point where simple compliance would end the encounter. The guard had made a professional decision that Thompson needed to be taught a lesson about respect, authority, and consequences. He continued his advance, now close enough that Thompson could see the details of his uniform, the serious expression on his face, and the very real rifle in his hands. The other members of Thompson's group finally began to understand that their friend had created a serious problem. One of them, Sarah, a psychology major who had been watching with growing concern, stepped forward and called out to Thompson. "Brad, you need to stop recording and apologize. This isn't funny anymore." Her intervention marked a turning point in the crowd's reaction. Other tourists began to speak up, with several people telling Thompson to show respect and back down. A British businessman approached one of Thompson's friends and explained in urgent, quiet tones that the Queen's Guard were real soldiers with real authority, not actors playing roles for tourist entertainment. Mitchell's advance brought him within arm's reach of Thompson, who was now pressed against a barrier with nowhere else to retreat. The guard stopped, came to perfect attention, and delivered what would become the most memorable part of the entire encounter. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but carried the weight of absolute authority. "You will show proper respect to the Queen's Guard, or you will be removed from these premises." The words were delivered with such calm intensity that they seemed to hang in the air. Thompson, faced with a trained soldier standing less than 3 feet away, finally understood that he had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed. His phone, which had been recording throughout the encounter, now felt heavy in his suddenly shaking hand. I'm sorry," Thompson stammered, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "I didn't mean, I was just having fun. I'm sorry." Mitchell stood motionless for several long seconds, allowing the apology to hang in the air while Thompson and everyone watching waited to see what would happen next. The silence stretched uncomfortably, creating a tension that made even distant observers hold their breath. The crowd had grown considerably, with tourists from all over the courtyard drawn by the commotion. Many were recording, ensuring that Thompson's humiliation would be preserved and shared far beyond the immediate audience. The incident was becoming exactly the kind of viral moment that would serve as a cautionary tale for future visitors about the importance of showing proper respect. Finally, Mitchell stepped back, executed another perfect military turn, and began marching back toward his post with the same measured precision that had characterized his advance. But the lesson wasn't over. The guard's return to position didn't signal the end of the encounter. It marked the beginning of a different kind of consequence for Thompson's behavior. The damage to Thompson's reputation was immediate and visible. Other tourists stared at him with expressions ranging from disapproval to outright disgust. His own friends seemed embarrassed by their association with him, and several moved away to distance themselves from the situation. The man who had started the morning as the bold leader of a dare had become the focal point of public shame and disapproval. The aftermath of the confrontation proved to be more devastating for Thompson than the encounter itself. As Mitchell returned to his post and resumed his ceremonial stance, the crowd's attention remained fixed on Thompson. But the nature of that attention had fundamentally changed. Where there had once been amusement and encouragement, there was now judgment and disapproval. Thompson stood awkwardly near the barrier where Mitchell had cornered him, still clutching his phone but no longer recording. His face was flushed with embarrassment and the adrenaline crash that followed his sudden realization of how seriously he had miscalculated the situation. The confident swagger that had characterized his approach to the guard post had been completely replaced by obvious discomfort and shame. Other tourists began to approach, but not to congratulate him on his earlier bravado. Instead, several people took the opportunity to educate him about what he had just experienced. A retired British Army officer, who had been visiting the palace with his wife, walked over and spoke in measured, serious tones about the significance of the Queen's Guard and the disrespect Thompson had shown. "Those men aren't performers, son," the veteran explained, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood military tradition. "They're active soldiers from some of our finest regiments. What you just did was equivalent to harassing a soldier on duty. In some countries, that behavior could get you arrested or worse." Thompson's friends, who had initially encouraged his behavior and found it entertaining, now seemed eager to distance themselves from the incident. Sarah, who had tried to intervene earlier, was visibly angry with Thompson for ignoring the warnings she and others had tried to give him. The group dynamic that had supported his initial challenge to the guard had completely dissolved. The social media aspect of the incident began to take on a life of its own. Multiple tourists had recorded different angles of the confrontation, and several were already uploading the footage to various platforms. Thompson's moment of perceived triumph was rapidly becoming a viral example of tourist behavior gone wrong, shared with commentary about American ignorance and disrespect for foreign traditions. A palace security official approached Thompson and his group, explaining politely but firmly that they needed to move away from the area. While Thompson wasn't being arrested or formally ejected, it was made clear that his continued presence near the guard posts wasn't welcome. The official also mentioned that all incidents involving the Queen's Guard were documented and that repeat offenses would result in more serious consequences. The educational impact of the encounter extended far beyond Thompson himself. Other tourists who had witnessed the confrontation began sharing their own stories and knowledge about the Queen's Guard, creating impromptu discussions about military tradition, respect for authority, and cultural differences. Many visitors expressed surprise at learning that the guards were active soldiers rather than ceremonial performers. Mitchell, having returned to his post, showed no outward signs of the recent confrontation. His stance was perfect, his expression neutral, and his focus returned to his duties. To the casual observer, he appeared exactly as he had before the incident began. This demonstration of professional composure impressed many in the crowd and served as a stark contrast to Thompson's obvious emotional state. The ripple effects of the incident continued to spread throughout the tourist area. Other visitors became noticeably more respectful in their interactions around the guard posts, giving the soldiers more space and speaking in quieter tones. The confrontation had served as a powerful reminder that these were real military personnel, deserving of proper respect. Thompson's university group found themselves becoming the subject of unwanted attention from other American tourists in the area. Several approached to express embarrassment at Thompson's behavior and to apologize on behalf of their fellow Americans. This secondary wave of social pressure added another layer to Thompson's growing understanding of how badly he had misjudged the situation. The psychological impact on Thompson became increasingly evident as the morning progressed. What had started as a confident challenge to get a reaction from a guard had transformed into a humiliating public lesson in respect and consequences. His body language changed dramatically, shifting from the cocky posture of earlier to a hunched, defensive stance that suggested he wanted nothing more than to disappear. Meanwhile, other members of the Queen's Guard at nearby posts remained at their duties, but those observant enough to notice could see subtle signs of increased alertness. Word of the incident had spread through their communication network, and while they maintained their ceremonial positions, they were clearly more prepared for potential troublemakers. The incident began to take on educational value for other visitors. Parents used the confrontation as a teaching moment for their children about respecting authority and understanding cultural differences. Tour guides incorporated the recent events into their commentary, explaining the role and importance of the Queen's Guard in British military tradition. Thompson's phone, which had captured much of his humiliation, now felt like evidence of his poor judgment rather than proof of his boldness. The footage he had recorded would serve as a permanent reminder of the moment when his overconfidence met professional military discipline and lost decisively. As the crowd around the area began to thin out, with many visitors moving on to other parts of their palace tours, Thompson found himself isolated with his shame and his new understanding of the consequences of disrespectful behavior. The lesson was far from over, and the full impact of his actions was still revealing itself in ways he was only beginning to understand. The long-term consequences of Thompson's confrontation with the Queen's Guard began to unfold in ways he never could have anticipated when he accepted his friend's dare that morning. Within hours of the incident, the multiple video recordings of his humiliation had found their way onto social media platforms, where they began spreading rapidly among networks of users, fascinated by examples of tourist behavior gone wrong. The viral nature of the incident meant that Thompson's face and actions became recognizable to thousands of people across multiple platforms. The videos were shared with commentary ranging from amused mockery to serious discussions about cultural respect and the importance of understanding local customs when traveling. His moment of perceived bravery had become a cautionary tale viewed by audiences far beyond those who had witnessed it in person. Back at their London hostel that evening, Thompson and his friends found themselves dealing with the immediate social consequences of the morning's events. Other American students staying at the facility had already seen the videos online and weren't shy about expressing their opinions. Many were embarrassed that a fellow American had behaved so disrespectfully, and they made their feelings known through pointed comments and obvious avoidance. The group dynamics that had supported Thompson's initial challenge completely collapsed under the weight of social pressure and second-guessing. His friends, who had encouraged him and found his behavior entertaining in the moment, now distanced themselves from both him and their role in encouraging the confrontation. Sarah, in particular, was vocal about her disappointment in both Thompson's actions and her own group's failure to stop him sooner. Thompson spent the evening researching the Queen's Guard online, finally learning what he should have known before his morning adventure. The discovery that these were elite soldiers from prestigious regiments with real military authority and responsibility hit him with full force. Reading about their training, their role in national security, and the respect they commanded within, the British military made his earlier behavior seem even more foolish and disrespectful. The educational aspect of his experience extended beyond military history. Thompson began to understand the broader implications of cultural sensitivity and the importance of research before traveling. His assumption that foreign customs and traditions existed primarily for tourist entertainment revealed a level of cultural ignorance that he was only now beginning to recognize and address. Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, the incident had become part of the ongoing conversation among the guard units about tourist behavior and appropriate responses. While confrontations like Thompson's weren't uncommon, they served as training opportunities and reminders about the importance of maintaining both discipline and authority when dealing with disrespectful visitors. Mitchell, the guard who had handled the situation, received commendation from his superiors for his professional response to Thompson's provocation. His ability to escalate appropriately while maintaining military bearing was seen as an exemplary demonstration of the standards expected from the Queen's Guard. The incident would likely be used in future training scenarios as an example of proper response to tourist disruption. The ripple effects of the confrontation continued to spread through tourist communities both online and in London itself. Other visitors to British historical sites began showing noticeably more respectful behavior around military and ceremonial personnel, having been reminded through Thompson's experience that these weren't actors or entertainers, but real people with real authority. Thompson's university back in Texas also became aware of the incident when the viral videos reached campus social media groups. While there were no formal academic consequences, the social impact was significant. His reputation among fellow students shifted dramatically, and he found himself known not for boldness or humor, but for cultural insensitivity and poor judgment. The psychological impact on Thompson deepened over the following days as he processed the full scope of his mistake. The confidence and bravado that had characterized his approach to the guard post were replaced by genuine reflection about respect, authority, and the consequences of his actions. For the first time, he began to understand that his behavior had real impacts on real people, not just entertainment value for social media. His relationship with his travel companions became increasingly strained as the week progressed. What should have been a fun spring break experience became overshadowed by the constant reminder of the morning's events and their ongoing consequences. The group found themselves having serious conversations about behavior, respect, and representation of American tourists abroad. The incident also sparked broader discussions among American students abroad about cultural sensitivity and appropriate tourist behavior. Thompson's experience became a case study in what not to do when visiting foreign countries, particularly those with strong military traditions and ceremonial customs. Local British media picked up on the story as part of broader coverage about tourist behavior at royal sites. While Thompson wasn't named individually, his actions were discussed in the context of ongoing challenges faced by sites like Buckingham Palace in balancing tourist access with maintaining the dignity and security of their operations. The financial impact also began to manifest as Thompson discovered that several planned activities and tours for the rest of their London visit had become uncomfortable or impossible due to his newfound notoriety among tourist communities. The social consequences were limiting his ability to enjoy the remainder of his trip. As the days passed, Thompson began to realize that his few minutes of perceived entertainment had created consequences that would follow him long after his return home. The viral nature of the incident meant that his mistake would be preserved and searchable online indefinitely, serving as a permanent reminder of the importance of cultural respect and the lasting impact of poor decisions in the age of social media. 6 months after the confrontation at Buckingham Palace, the full scope of Thompson's encounter with the Queen's Guard had crystallized into a lasting lesson that extended far beyond the immediate participants. The incident had become part of internet folklore, regularly resurfacing in discussions about tourist behavior, cultural respect, and the consequences of viral moments in the digital age. Thompson's life back at the University of Texas had been permanently altered by those few minutes in London. The viral videos had followed him home, and his campus reputation was forever linked to the incident. While some classmates eventually moved on to other topics, the core story remained part of his identity. Job interviews during his senior year occasionally included awkward moments when potential employers recognized him from the videos, leading to uncomfortable conversations about judgment and professionalism. The educational impact of the incident proved to be more valuable than Thompson initially realized. His experience became a case study used by several universities in their study abroad preparation programs. Students preparing for international travel were shown the videos as examples of what not to do, and Thompson's story became a cautionary tale about the importance of cultural research and respectful behavior when visiting foreign countries. Mitchell, the Queen's Guard who had handled the confrontation, continued his distinguished service and eventually received promotion within his regiment. His professional response to Thompson's provocation was cited in his service record as an example of exemplary conduct under pressure. The incident became part of training scenarios for new guards, demonstrating proper escalation procedures when dealing with disrespectful tourists. The broader impact on tourist behavior at Buckingham Palace and other British royal sites was notably positive. Guards and security personnel reported a significant decrease in disruptive behavior following the widespread circulation of Thompson's humiliation. The incident served as a powerful reminder to visitors that the ceremonial aspects of these sites didn't diminish the real authority and professionalism of the personnel involved. Thompson's friends from the London trip maintained mixed relationships with him following their return. Some, like Sarah, remained disappointed in both his behavior and their group's initial encouragement of it. Others eventually forgave the incident, but acknowledged that it had changed their perspective on travel behavior and cultural sensitivity. The group's friendship dynamics never fully recovered to their pre-London state. The social media aspect of the story continued to evolve over time. While the initial viral wave eventually subsided, the videos remained searchable and continued to attract new viewers. Thompson learned to live with the reality that his moment of poor judgment had become part of the permanent digital record, accessible to anyone curious enough to search for examples of tourist behavior gone wrong. British military historians and cultural commentators occasionally reference the incident in broader discussions about the evolution of tourist behavior at historical sites. The confrontation was seen as representative of changing attitudes toward authority and tradition, as well as the challenges posed by social media culture in maintaining respect for ceremonial and military customs. Thompson eventually channeled his experience into something constructive. During his final year of college, he began volunteering with international student orientation programs, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about cultural sensitivity and the importance of research before traveling. His presentations were well received, with students appreciating the honest account of his mistakes and their consequences. The incident also contributed to policy discussions at various tourist sites about balancing accessibility with maintaining appropriate respect for ceremonial functions. While most sites wanted to remain welcoming to international visitors, Thompson's story highlighted the ongoing challenges of managing tourists who might not understand or respect local customs and authority structures. Years later, Thompson reflected on the incident as a pivotal moment in his personal development. What had started as a foolish dare had become a comprehensive education in respect, consequences, and cultural sensitivity. While he regretted the disrespectful behavior and its impact on others, he acknowledged that the experience had fundamentally changed his approach to travel, cultural interaction, and personal responsibility. The Queen's Guard continued their duties with the same professionalism and dignity that had characterized Mitchell's response to Thompson's provocation. New guards were trained using scenarios based on real incidents, including Thompson's, ensuring that future personnel would be prepared to maintain both military bearing and appropriate authority when faced with similar challenges. The lasting lesson of the confrontation transcended the immediate participants and became part of the broader conversation about cultural respect in an interconnected world. Thompson's few minutes of poor judgment served as a reminder that actions have consequences, that cultural traditions deserve respect regardless of their unfamiliarity, and that the internet never forgets moments of public failure. The story ultimately became one of education rather than mere entertainment. While Thompson's humiliation provided initial amusement for viewers, the deeper lessons about respect, authority, and cultural sensitivity proved to be the incident's most valuable legacy. His encounter with the Queen's Guard demonstrated that some battles are lost before they begin, especially when ignorance meets discipline and disrespect confronts tradition. In the end, the question posed in the original dare, who would win, between royal guards and tourists with no common sense, had been definitively answered. Professional military discipline, backed by real authority and genuine consequence, would always triumph over misplaced bravado and cultural ignorance. Thompson learned this lesson the hard way, but his experience ensured that countless others could learn it more easily through his example.